get started. Okay, so start a new chapter today. It's going to be on distributed file systems. Before I start, just a couple of quick announcements. There is a lab due this week. I had said that you can terminate it on Friday. So please make sure you get it in no later than Friday. And I also put up a homework. It's been a while since we had one. Been wanting to give it out, but there was a lab due, so I put it up today. It's due next week, okay, a week from today. It's a short homework, so hopefully it shouldn't take a whole lot of time. With that, let's continue from where we left off last time. We finished the discussion on fault tolerance. Okay, so that was basically the problem of how do you deal with failures in the system, how can you deal with particularly Byzantine faults, and if you have failures, how do you reach agreement. So a broad set of techniques that we covered. We are going to switch gear and talk about file systems now, specifically distributed file systems. So I'm going to start with a very quick overview of standalone file systems using Unix file systems as an example. That's just a 2-slide refresher from undergraduate operating system, just so that everyone is on the same page. Then I'm going to start talking about distributed file system issues, and for the rest of today's class we will look at one file system in particular, which is NFS, or network file system. Next time we will continue the case studies on file systems and look at least 3 more file systems: CODA, XFS, which is generalization of log structured file systems, and HDFS. Okay, so that's what is coming up today and in the next class. Okay. So some basics. What is a file? A file is a named collection of data. Okay, it's a container of data that you store on a disk, and you give it a name. The name allows you to get to your file at a later point in time. Okay, as in the Unix operating systems, okay, most Unix-like operating systems like UL Linux, BSD, and so on, a Unix file is an uninterpreted sequence of bytes. So the file system doesn't care about what's inside the file. It doesn't actually interpret the data inside the file. Okay, that's left to the applications. Now the file system itself provides a logical view of the data. What that means is users don't have to deal with where on disk do they store their data and so on. Okay, you basically create files, you group files into folders. The file system takes care of mapping your files to blocks on a disk. Okay, files are partitioned into a set of blocks. Blocks are mapped onto the disk. Okay, so you get a more user-friendly interface from the OS. It also allows you to create files, delete files, organize files, give them names, and so on. Okay, and you can share them as well, or not share them using protection information. I already said that as far as Unix is concerned, it's an uninterpreted sequence of bytes. So a file is simply a set of bits. That's how Unix deals with it. Doesn't actually provide any structure. Having said that, there are other file systems that actually interpret what is inside the file. They can interpret a structure. So there were record-based file systems, for example, that said that each file is a collection of records. Records are fields, and so on. These file systems were designed specifically for databases, so that databases could efficiently store their data on disks. Because some file systems have what are called file types associated with files. So the file system knows that this file is a Java source code, or it's a Word document, or a PowerPoint file, or HTML file. Okay, and it can take appropriate action. In the Unix case, you do not actually have any notion of file types. You do not interpret what's inside the file. So all files, regardless of what's stored in there, are treated as a sequence of bytes. Okay? So that's basically what a file is. As far as the file system is concerned, okay, the files system is essentially starts off being a tree, but essentially it's a directed acyclic graph, starting with the root directory. And then the root directory may have a set of subdirectories. That's like user, etc, and so on. These might have other directories and so on. And the leaf of all of this tree is essentially will be files. Okay, you know already all of that. So now the reason this is not a tree but a directed acyclic graph is that most operating systems will allow you to create symbolic links or hard links to files. What that allows you to do is multiple file names will actually point to the same file. Okay, so if you create a link in Windows world, this is called a shortcut, which is a equivalent of a soft link. Okay, so that makes this not a tree but a directed acyclic graph, because there will be multiple files. Okay, not multiple files, multiple names which will point to the same exact file. Okay, because you created hard links between them. Okay, so now again in the Unix world, or in most cases, you are allowed to have aliases for the file. So a file can have multiple names, but you are not allowed to have aliases for directories. You cannot actually share directories in this manner. Okay? The reason for that is if you have two paths that actually point to the same directory, not the same file, this may actually lead to an infinite loop where you may actually create a descendant may actually go back and point to the parent, and that's going to cause a loop in your directed acyclic graph, which by definition it's a directed acyclic graph. So you want to avoid cycles in the tree. If you have cycles, then you have all sorts of problems. If you're doing backups and so on, you'll basically sit in the loop and never terminate, okay, because you're going to go into the tree and access all of the data. Okay. Is that clear? I presume all of you have heard of hard links and soft links and so on. Okay, the basic undergraduate stuff. I'm assuming you all know this. If not, you should ask. Don't hesitate to ask the question. Okay. Now, for each file, there is something called metadata that shows. So there are data and metadata. Okay, most file systems distinguish between how they store the data and how they store the metadata. Okay. A metadata for a file would be things like what is the name of the file, what is the ID of the file, which is often in the Unix world called the inode number. It would have information as what is the size of the file, where are the blocks of the file stored. So metadata is data about the data, okay, which would include everything from the file name to file creation time, file modification time, file sizes, and then where are the blocks of the file stored on disk and so on. Okay. Typically, the metadata of the file is stored separately from the data. Okay. When we talk about distributed file systems, we'll see scenarios where data and metadata get mixed up and so on, but at least you need to know how standard Unix-like file system stores it. Okay, so metadata is always stored separately from the data. When you format your file system on disk, there's a special area created on the disk which is called the super block. Okay. Typically, you may have more than one super block, but let's assume there is at least one super block. So the super block is where all of the metadata for all files of your file system will be stored. Okay? And the data will be stored in regular blocks. Okay? So super blocks are where you are going to store up in the Unix world, as I'll say mentioned in the next slide. You have something called index nodes or inodes. Okay? And so all the inodes are stored in a well-known location on disk, which is the super block. Okay? So when you open a file, you need to access a file, you can simply go to its corresponding inode and then access it from there. And you know where the inodes are stored because they are going to be stored on the super block. Okay, is that clear? Any questions on this? Okay, so I'm going to quickly show you inode structure. Okay, so this is basically a typical Unix-like file system. Inode is that structure. Inode stands for index node. Okay. It is the structure that stores metadata for the file. This is all information about the file itself. So you will see that it has the ID of the owner who created the file, what is the Unix group to which that file belongs, what is the directory to which the file belongs, what are the protection bits, who can read, write, execute this file. So all of that is stored in the these are all fields of the index node. Okay? Last access time, last time of write, size of the file, okay, how large is the file, how many blocks belong to the file. There's something called a ref count which says how many different names point to the same file. Typically, a file has at least one name, but as I said, because of the way you can create shortcuts and whatnot, you can have multiple names. So that's ref count is a counter that says how many different names refer to this file. And last but not least, there is a set of pointers that are going to actually point to the disk blocks of the file. Okay, so if you want to actually access some block, you are going to first read the inode. Okay, from the inode, you are going to figure out which data block you want, and you are going to look in this index. Okay, and this is going to point you. This is going to hold disk addresses. Okay, so if you want the fifth block, you are going to look at the fifth entry here. and that's going to say that block is stored at this location on disk. Okay, this cylinder and this track and this sector and so on. Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the inode is a multi-level index structure. Okay, it's not a single level index. What that means is some of these entries directly point to disk blocks. Some other entries point to blocks that themselves then point to disk. It means there's one level of indirection. Okay, this entry will point you to a block that will actually have the disk pointer. These won't be the disk pointers themselves. Okay, so it's a multi-level index. And the question is, why do you need a multi-level index? Okay, if you actually have any recollection of what you may have studied in undergrad OS class, you have any recollection of why we need a multi-level index as opposed to a direct index? Yeah, direct index would mean that every block of the file there would be an address here. Okay, so in other words, this would be an array. This is your disk. These are directly pointing to disk blocks. Okay, that's your direct index. Okay. This doesn't do that. This is going to have some of these would be direct pointers. Others would actually point to a block that would then point to disk blocks. Then you may have actually double indirect where you have to follow 2 levels of indirection before you get to disk. That's how a multi-level index works. And the question is, why do we have it? Any thoughts, questions? Okay, so you can have larger files. Okay, so now, of course, you can have large files by also having direct blocks, pointers. Okay. The only problem is when you create this structure, okay, you do not know how large the file is going to be that is going to be created at a later point. Inodes are pre-allocated when you format the file system. Okay. So when you format the file system, you don't know the size of each file that is going to be created on the file system. The file system is empty. So if you provision for the worst case, then you will have to create an empty array here of the maximum possible file size you can support. Okay, so if you say, I support 1 gigabyte file, you may have tens of thousands of entries in that array. Yeah, but most files are going to be small, and if you pre-allocate for every inode a very large empty array, you are going to waste disk space. Okay? So you want a way to not have a very large empty structure, but you want the structure to grow dynamically. So what you do is you actually, as you will see, you only create 15 entries. Okay, so this goes from 0 to 14. So you basically create 15 empty addresses. The first 12 addresses will be direct block pointers. Okay? If the file grows to 13th block, you will actually create a block on the disk on the fly, which is not part of the super block. It's a regular block, and then you will store the next 1,000 or so pointers in that disk block. Okay? If the block goes beyond that size, then you will allocate another block that will actually be 2 levels of indirection. So you will have 1024 square pointers, and then you can have a triple indirect as well. Okay? So this allows you to gradually grow the file without having to pre-allocate a large empty array which may not be used for most files. Okay? So you are making more efficient use of disk space in this case. Is that clear? Any questions on this? This is how an inode works. Okay? Okay, so with that quick refresher, let's talk about distributed file systems. Okay, so here we are going to assume, okay, that the user can access data that is stored on remote disks. Okay, in a local file system, the application is running on the machine and the disk is on the same machine, all the files are on the same machine. That's a typical scenario. You can have your laptop or a desktop, you're running something and all that the files are stored on the same machine. In a distributed file system, the files would be stored on a machine that's different from where the applications are. So you have a client-server architecture where there is a server that is going to serve files. It's called a file server. Okay, that is and the disk that is on the file server is going to store your data. Clients would be arbitrary machines that ask the file server to serve files to them. Okay, so you are able to access files stored on a remote disk. Okay, that is essentially. And you will have multiple clients and you can have multiple servers. It doesn't mean there's only one file server. You can have a collection of machines that collectively store all of the files that are part of your file system. Okay, your file system itself is distributed across multiple servers. But you need at least one server and one client. Typically you will have multiple clients and multiple servers. Okay. So that is basically what we are going to look at, how to design such systems. Okay, so we are going to distinguish between the file service and the file server. Okay. File server is the machine where these files are stored that are being accessed by remote clients. Okay. File service is the API that you are going to use to access these files. Okay, so file service is the interface that a client can use to request files that are stored on the file server. And file server is simply an implementation of that interface that allows clients to connect and say, give me this file or give me some other file. Okay, so you have to distinguish between the service and the server. Okay. We are going to look at least one interface today, which is the NFS interface. Okay, and I'm also going to talk about the NFS implementation, which is the file server that NFS is going to implement for us. Okay, so there are just definitions of terms. So here I'm going to show you two canonical models for implementing a distributed file system. Okay. One model is called the remote access model. The other model, which is shown in that other picture, is called the upload-download model. Okay. In the remote access model, when a client wants to access a file, maybe it wants to perform read operation or write operation on the file, it is simply going to send those requests over to the server. The server is going to perform those operations for you and send back the results. Okay. So think of an RPC-like interface as an example, where the server implements a read RPC and a write RPC and an open RPC. The client will simply say, read, open this file. You send off an RPC, the server will actually do whatever it needs to do, send back the reply. You say, read some content blocks of the file. You send that request, get back the data, and so on. Okay, this is called the upload remote access model. Okay. An alternative implementation is called the upload-download model, where what is going to happen is the file server is going to store the master copy of the file. When the client accesses it for the first time, it is going to make a copy of that file locally. It's going to bring the entire file over, okay, and it's going to make a copy here. All subsequent accesses from that client are going to be performed on the local copy. Okay? And either when the file is closed or at some periodic points in time, if the file is modified, it's the job of the client to go and update the master copy, saying, I brought a copy over, my local copy was modified, here are the modifications, so the master copy is synchronized with the local copy. Okay? So here, beyond the initial access to the file, all subsequent accesses are local I/O. You have a copy of that file on the disk, so you do local I/O. Here, all I/Os are always remote. Okay? So you have these two different models of how file systems actually implement remote access. Okay, we are going to look at pros and cons of both. We are going to look in the NFS case how both of them work. Okay. But at a generic level, you can see that there are several differences. Okay. So here you could implement your server as a stateless server. Okay. Every request is sent to the server from the client, so the client doesn't actually need to figure out who is accessing the file and so on. This by definition has to be stateful because the server has to keep track. There could be lots of clients, not just one, as are shown in the picture. The server has to keep track of which client has downloaded which copies of the file, because consistency is a problem here. Okay, you are going to ensure the consistency of the local copy on the client with the master copy on the server. So you need to keep track of who has what data. So here, this model will require the server to be stateful. This doesn't require the server to be stateful. You can make it, but you can make it stateless as well. Okay, so here consistency is easy because there is only one copy. You cannot have inconsistencies if there aren't replicas to begin with. Okay? Here consistency has to be thought through carefully because there would be multiple copies. You have 10 clients, all of them have opened the same file. Now there are 10 copies floating around on 10 machines. Okay, if anyone makes a change, you have to send the change to the server. The server has to inform all the other clients saying the file has changed. Otherwise, you are working on outdated versions of the file, which causes problem. Okay, so consistency is important to deal with in upload-download mode. Okay, so these are some generic trade-offs. We are going to come back to NFS and look at this in more detail. Okay. Are there any questions on this? Okay, so far so good. So that's the file service. Okay. I already mentioned the stateful and stateless server. Let me just reiterate what they mean. In a stateless server, The server doesn't actually need to keep track of which clients have files open, who is accessing what, because all requests are in this case being sent to the server. So there is no additional need to track what is going on. In stateful, like tolerance or robustness to failures and so on. In stateless servers, they are more tolerant to crashes. If the server goes down and comes back up, nothing bad has happened other than the clients could not access files during the downtime. Right? In the stateful server, if the client loses server crashes, it no longer knows who has copies of which file. There is going to be a problem maintaining consistency. So if you keep track of the state in memory, okay, that's the assumption, then you may have problem. Okay, so fault tolerance is harder in this case. Okay. We will see that you can do other things like idempotency and so on. We'll come back to that. Okay, so let us now actually take a look at a specific file system. In this case, we are going to start with NFS, see how some of these high-level decisions translate into actual implementation. Okay, so what is the interface, how it's built and so on. So this is the picture you have to keep in mind. Okay. When I talked about RPCs, way back in the early days of the course, you will remember that I said the first implementation of RPCs was for NFS. I said that NFS was the reason RPCs became popular, because when the first implementation of NFS was actually being put in place, they decided RPC is a good way for the client and server to talk to one another. Okay, in other words, NFS is heavily built on top of RPC as an underlying communication mechanism, and that is what you will see here. You will see that there's an NFS client and an NFS server that talk using RPC. There are stubs here, so the entire NFS implementation works over RPCs. Okay, that's the first thing to keep in mind. Yeah. The other thing you will see from this picture is there is something here called the virtual file system layer, or the VFS layer. This is a pretty standard technique that most operating system kernels will provide. Okay, so what they will do is they will support, most OSs are going to have support for lots of different file systems. Okay? You may have support for the FAT file system, you may have support for the ISO file system, you may support NTFS, you may support ext3. There will be a whole lot of file systems for which support is built into the file system, into the operating system. And the way, the OS is actually going to deal with this is you will have a layer here called the virtual file system layer, or VFS layer, and all the implementations of these various file systems, including NFS, are modules that sit underneath. Okay, so here is a local file system. Let's say this is NTFS. Okay, so that would be the code for NTFS. Here is NFS client. Okay, so this is NFS code sitting in the OS kernel. You may have, if you use USB drives or whatever, they will typically have a FAT file system built up. There will be a FAT implementation. If you have a CD or a DVD-ROM, it would have an ISO file system on it. Okay, so there will be another file system. So when the application makes a call to access a file, the call is going to come to the VFS layer. At this point, the VFS layer is responsible for forwarding the call to one of these actual implementation. Because as far as the operating application is concerned, it is just going to do a read on a file. It's going to simply say read. Okay? Or the application programmer, when you try to read a file, you don't care what file system implementation is being used. You just say read this file. You open the file and you read it. Okay? So you are going to use or you will use the read system call, which is also generic. It's not dependent on the file system. Okay, so that call is going to come here. And then the VFS layer is going to say which file system does this file reside on. Okay? If it's a ext file system, it will forward the read to the read implementation in this code. Okay? If it's NFS, it will call the NFS version of read. If it is FAT, it's going to call the FAT's implementation of read. So each file system module has to implement a read call and a write call and an open call, all the functions that you expect of that file system. So those are all going to be replicated here. Okay? This is essentially going to be a redirecting layer. Okay, it's going to say, should I send the call here? Should I send the call here? Should I send the call to some other implementation of a file system, depending on where the file resides, okay, and what file system has been used to implement to store data on that device. Okay. So for our purposes, since we're only talking about NFS, we only have two cases that I've shown in this picture. There's either a local file system or a remote file system. So when the application accesses a file, In this case, the only decision is this file local to my disk, which is here, or is the file remote? Okay, depending on that, the VFS layer is going to either send that read, write, whatever request is here, or it's going to send it here. Okay? So let's say you are actually accessing a remote file, in which case the client is going to just use your standard read, but the code, the call actually is sent to the NFS client. NFS client is going to make a request to the NFS server saying, here, go and process this read or write request or whatever the request is. Okay. So it's going to arrive at the stub. Then the NFS server is simply going to forward it to its VFS layer. Okay. And that VFS layer is going to realize that this is actually a request for a local file, although the request has come from another machine. It's simply a request to a local file, so it's going to come back down here. The local file system is going to perform the operation, okay, send it back to the NFS server. NFS server is going to send a reply to the NFS client, which is going to reply to the application. Okay, so that's how requests are going to flow through the system. Okay, so you're going to use this notion of a VFS layer to make the right decisions on the right systems. Any questions on this? Alright, so with that, let's look at the interface, or this is the file service or the API that NFS support. Okay, so these are all the calls every NFS implementation has to support. And you'll see all sorts of standard operations that says create a file, open a file, close a file, the lookup operation, there's a read and write, which are obviously read some data from a file, write some data from a file, and so on. And there are lots of others which allow you to rename a file, it allows you to create a link or a symbolic link, which are shortcuts to a file, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there are a whole set of interface calls that you have to support. And what is shown in this picture is two versions of NFS. NFS version 3, which is still popular, but is getting slowly replaced with a new version called version 4. Yeah, I think there are still implementations that do V3, but V4 is actually the most recent version. Right? It tells you what this column is showing you is that there are some differences between the version 3 implementation and version 4 implementation. Okay? And depending on the differences, some of these operations are supported under version 3 but not under version 4, or vice versa. And some like read and write are supported, obviously. You can't get rid of read and write. Okay? That's always going to be supported. So what is the main difference? Okay, so the main difference is that NFS historically has been implemented as a stateless protocol. Okay, NFS philosophy was keep no state at the server. Okay, server will not keep track of state of what the clients are doing. This is how NFS version 1 was built, 2 was built, and 3 was built. And so that basically the interface remained not a whole lot different between versions 1 and 3. But in version 4, they made a major change in their thinking, and they said that for certain things, we have to make the server stateful. So they went away from their philosophy saying the server should always be stateless, and they said, and we'll see what these things are, that you need to actually keep state at the server. And because the server has now become stateful, there are certain additional operations you may have to support. Okay? And that's really the main difference. Okay? And what you will see is what are the implications of this. So in particular, I'm going to point out a couple of these. You will see that there is an open call here. Open call simply opens a file. That's how you actually do file I/O. You do a file and you first open the file and you can read and write to a file. I presume all of you know that. Okay? So you will see in NFS version 3, there was no open call at all. Okay? But in version 4, there is an open call. Okay? Now you may ask, why is that? Okay, does it mean that in version 3 you do not have to open a file before you read and write? Okay, so first thing you have to realize to understand this is, what does an open call do? Okay, if you take a local file system and you open a file, it's going to check, are you allowed to access this file? Okay, do you have the right permissions and whatnot? And if so, you are going to basically be given a file descriptor back. Okay? And then subsequently you use this file descriptor to access the file. Okay? You don't specify the file name over and over again. You simply use the file descriptor or the file pointer, and you continue to access that file using the file descriptor or pointer. Okay? Now what does that mean? What that means is actually there is state that the OS is keeping track of, which is the file descriptor. When you present the file descriptor every time, the OS knows what file that corresponds to. So in other words, when the local file system, the kernel is stateful. When it gives you a file descriptor, it has an internal table saying file descriptor 10 corresponds to this file, and so on. Okay? So that is what a local file system is. Now if you wanted to implement the same thing in NFS, okay, if you said an open and then you return the file descriptor from the server has become stateful. Next time if you present the file descriptor saying, I want to read one block of this file, here is the file descriptor, the server would actually need to know what this thing is. Okay? That by definition makes the server stateful. Okay? But I just said that until version 3 the server was stateless. It did not keep track of any state from any client. Okay? So that basically tells you something as simple as open, which returns the file descriptor, is fundamentally incompatible with NS's philosophy of the server being stateless. Okay? This is why until NFS version 3 there was no open call at all. Okay? So now what does that actually mean from a client's perspective? Does a client not have to open a file if it's NFS? No, that's not the case. Okay, the client will still open the file. The NFS client will make a fake handle and give it back to the client. Okay? So now the state is not stored at the server, is stored at the client. The client knows that you opened file user local bin foo, and it gives you a local file descriptor. It's not a file descriptor that the server knows. So subsequently, if the client says, here's a file descriptor, read me one block of the file, now it will come to the NFS client. The NFS client knows what the user is trying to access, and then the client has to send a request to the server saying, here is the entire file name. Give me one block of the file. Okay? So in other words, if you have a stateless server, every time you do a read and write or any operation, you have to give the entire information. What file are you trying to access? What is your username? What is all of that has to be done over and over again, because there is no state kept at the server at all. You don't know who made the access. Every time you may have to do these checks. Okay? So this is basically all of this complexity is now moved from the client server to the client. Okay? So this is why when you open the file, okay, from a user's perspective, the client is not going to make an open request to the server and try to get any state. It's going to do some local checks and say, oh fine, it will pretend like the file is open. Okay? And every time you are going to present the whole credential is called a magic cookie to the server saying, here is the user trying to access, this is the file, go access this file, and so on. Okay? So that is, so when you make the server stateful, you have to deal with all these additional problems. Okay? Version 4 doesn't have to do it because version 4 allows you to keep state, so you can do the things the regular way. If you make an open call, the client can make an open to the server can keep state, it knows who has accessed which files, including remote client, it can give you descriptors and handles and so on if you want, and that's just the interface. You can keep state in the server. But stateless servers cannot do that. Okay? So this is just to give you some idea as to what stateless actually means. It creates more work because there are certain things you cannot figure out what has happened in the past. You're not allowed to keep state in the server. So each time it looks like this is a fresh request, I have no idea, I have no memory of what has gone on. Okay? Which is not the case when you typically open a file, you are keeping state of. So these are all issues to keep in mind. Okay? And I'll talk about other things that you can do with state, but this is just to show you that. Okay. Now there is another call here called the lookup operation. Okay, so even though there is no open operation, there is a lookup operation which allows you to actually, the client to talk to the server and figure out what are the permission bits on the file and so on. Okay? When you open, you are not going to ask the server to open the file, but nevertheless, you are going to check, does this user have permissions to access the file? So you have to do those checks. You can't just let this client access whatever files you want. So this is the call that is used to do those checks, and I'm going to show you a figure of how typically things work. So this is typically what is going to happen. Okay, when you do an open on version 3, okay, there is no open call that's going to go to the server. Instead, the client will make a lookup call saying, does this file exist, first of all? Okay, is this a valid file? And if the file exists, what are the permissions of the file, and can I actually let the client access the file? All of that is going to be done through the lookup call. If that lookup call says everything looks good, and when you subsequently make a read, you will send off the read to the server while specifying the whole information. There's no descriptor here that you can tell the client. You're going to say the read is going to have the file name and all of those attributes. Typically, it's encoded in the form of what's called a magic cookie, so that you don't send long strings and so on, but you have to send this information every time. So this is essentially the set of operations that you will see in an NFS client and an NFS server, and these are all RPC calls. Okay. Now NFS version 4 would actually do the same thing, okay, but you will see that there is an open in there as well. Okay, you will do a lookup to do the checks. If the lookup succeeds, you will tell the server, I want to open this file, and so create some stateful. Okay, so you will have an open call, and then you will have a read call. Okay. Now, NFS version 4 also optimizes the performance of these multiple round trips between the client and the server. So it has this notion of a compound RPC. Okay. Compound RPC is simply a batch RPC. So instead of sending one RPC request in one network packet, you will see that you are sending 3 RPC requests in one packet. So in the same packet, you are saying, go do a lookup, go do an open, go do a read. Okay, all at once. Okay, so then it's basically a batching of RPCs so that you basically save on the network overhead of round trip types. So this will allow you to send in one request, one packet, or 3 requests, and there are 3 RPCs that will execute, and then the responses to all 3 will come back. Okay. So that's a performance optimization. You don't have to batch them, but if you batch them, you get some benefit of lower network overhead. Okay? Any questions on this? So that is compound RPC. So I'm going to show you a little bit about mount protocol. I don't know if any of you know about what a mount protocol is. It's a way by which NFS clients establish a connection to the NFS server for a certain volume. Okay, so the server, in this case you'll see that there's one server and 2 clients. The server has to, first of all, perform what is called an export operation that tells the OS saying, I'm going to let remote clients access this part of my subtree. Okay. So in this case, a standard technique is you may have a set of directories which are home directories of users that are stored on the server. The server will say all the home directory folders are exported, but some other folders I'm not going to let remote clients access them. Okay, so this is a way by which the NFS server tells the OS saying what files are remotely accessible and which files are not. Okay. So when the server boots up, you are going to actually look at the exports list and say these are the only files that can be, or directories that can be accessed. Okay. So that's the export step. Okay, once the export step is done, when the client boots up, it can actually ask the server saying, I want to access this volume, or I want to access this subtree. So in this case, you will see this client has gone and actually established a connection to this user's home directory. Okay. So this user's home directory, which is shown in that dotted line, is being made accessible on client A. Okay. This is called establishing a mount point. Okay. In the Windows world, this is like creating a network drive. Okay. You can make an E drive and an F drive and so on. So this is the equivalent of that in the NFS world, where you essentially mount, which means that a connection has been established between the client and the server, and when the server now accesses these files, the client or the client accesses this file, all those requests are going to be actually sent to the server to perform these reads and write operations. Okay. Now the user doesn't actually do any of this. Okay. This is the nice thing about NFS is these mount points are created by the system administrator. Okay. And when the system boots up, they are automatically established. So from a user's perspective, the files actually look like their local files, even though some of them are remote files. Okay. So that's the nice thing about the mount protocol. I'm going to show a quick example. If I can bring it up quickly. So you can actually look at, if you look at this file called exports. So you will see that there is a set of directories and it tells you who can access those directories. So these are the exports files. So here all the user directories are exported to a set of machines. Okay, this says these machines can access these volumes. Okay, and these are the only volumes that can be accessed remotely. It also lists the machines and even tells you what operations can be performed on those directories. So that's the export. So when you boot up, all of those machines can actually access those files. Okay. Now, if you actually look at what is as an NFS client, if you go and look at what the system has done, you will see that you will see an EDU, and you will essentially have a directory that has been shared by that NFS server, and you mount it here. Okay. In this case, it just happens to be Red Hat Linux 8 packages. So those are all exported by the server, they are mounted here. Okay. So if you cd into /exp/rfc/share, okay, that looks like a local directory, but it's really a remote directory, which is this directory. Okay. All requests that you make inside that folder are actually sent to that server, and it's going to access that volume on that server, or that directory on that server. Okay. The user doesn't know that these are remote files, they just look like remote local files too. Okay. Except that they are not, they are remote files. Okay. So this is referred to as a mount protocol. So this is a mount point. Okay. This is the connection established by the mount protocol saying this local directory actually maps to that remote directory. That's just the mapping that I showed you on the previous slide. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions here? Okay, so that is essentially what is done here by actually mounting files and so on. Okay. Now there are certain interesting restrictions or properties that you have to think about when you do mounts. Okay. So question is, if server A exports a directory, okay, you mount that directory on its client, okay, and this client decides to be a server for a third machine, and it exports a parent of that directory. So let's say it exports this larger directory. Okay. And this larger directory is now accessed by another machine. The question is, should you now allow transitive mounts? Okay. I mount some files, I export the parent of that subtree to yet another machine, and now when that machine tries to access it, should I now forward all of my mounted files and make them accessible or not? Okay. So these are called transitive mounts, where essentially I have one machine, okay, I basically mount those files, I take some parent of that directory and I mount it somewhere else. So question is now, this machine C, does it have access to these files, okay, which are actually on this machine? Okay. It certainly has access to files stored on B, because it directly mounted those. The question is, because B has mounted within that subtree some other files from yet another server, should C have access to it or not? Now typically this kind of transitive mount leads to security risk. Okay. So NFS has typically prohibited transitive mounts. Okay. And the reason it's a security risk is, let's say I trust you trust a friend and say, here, I am going to make my folder share it with you. Okay. Then you go and you share something that is a parent of that, and now a third person gets access to it. You have never intended to share with that third person. Okay. So that shouldn't be allowed typically. Okay. So which is why NFS is going to prohibit transitive mounts. Okay. Now, having said that, version 4 has some flexibility where it will do recursive lookups and allow transitive mounts, but until version 3 it was not even allowed. Okay, version 4 by default will not allow it, but some recursive lookups are allowed if you know what you are doing and you say that that's allowed in your system. Okay, but by definition you don't want to do that. Okay, is that clear? What the problem is, I presume that should be clear. Then it should be clear why you don't want transitive. Okay, so if you share something with the second person shouldn't be allowed to reshare that with someone else without you knowing about it. Okay, in this case, you wouldn't even know what is going on, because you will simply see a request coming from B, although they originated from C. So now suddenly you are exposing your data to third parties you didn't intend to share. So this is why you would actually in NFS, typically you are going to not allow this recursive mounting. Okay. That's exactly what is shown in this picture, where this directory is mounted here, some parent of this directory is mounted here, and the question is, should these files become accessible. Okay? Typically they won't become accessible. If you want them, you have to directly mount them from B. That's what you show. Okay. The last concept here that is interesting from the mount perspective is what is called auto mounting, which is called mount on demand. Okay. And mount on demand simply says that rather than creating mount points at boot time, which is the default configuration, you are going to simply create those associations but not actually access those files. You will only access those files on demand when a user goes and opens a file in that subdirectory or does a CD into that subdirectory. Okay. This simply reduces the amount of state that the server has to maintain, because you may have a very large number of mounts on the server. If you basically create all of those mount points at boot time, you will have to keep a very large file system table saying this mount point corresponds to this directory, this mount point corresponds to this directory, that state will blow up. So you create this on the fly as and when needed. Okay? An example of this is shown in this picture where you have a server. Here the server has a set of home directories for user. This is very similar to what happens on the EndLab as well. EndLab, your EndLab server that has all the home directories. Okay. So here is the home directory for user Alice. User Alice goes to a workstation and logs in. Okay. When she logs in, that is the time when the system is going to actually mount her home directory. It's not that all user home directories are mounted here all the time. The system says the user has logged in, she needs access to her home directory, let me mount her home directory on demand, and it does mount it. And while the user is accessing this machine, the mount directory is mounted. When the user logs out, in this case, the mount is actually disconnected, and you can remount if the user logs in. So this is called auto mounting or mount on demand. It's an optimization that reduces the amount of state that the client has to maintain in terms of what all things have been mounted. Okay. So last point I'm going to mention here is the NFS implementation. Okay, NFS is a standard. Okay, so there are many platforms that support it. It's cross-platform. You can have Windows machines accessing files on Linux and Linux accessing files on another machine and so on. There's no assumption made about what OS the client or server needs to run. So long as the server supports an NFS interface and the client has an NFS client implementation, client can access files stored on the server. Okay. There is not even any assumption made about what the underlying, or very little assumptions made about what the underlying file system needs to be. Okay. So you can layer an NFS server on a wide variety of local file systems. Okay. So because NFS is designed to be highly interoperable, it makes a minimum set of assumptions about what the local file system is going to give you. In particular, these are the only attributes that it assumes that each file system, local file system, is going to support, which is the type of the file. Is it a file directory or a symbolic link, the size of the file, okay, has the file changed, and some sort of an identifier for the server to access the file. Okay. So note here that these are what are called mandatory attributes, are so small that you don't even have the notion of the file is owned by a user. There's no user name here that is part of the file. Right? This is done for NFS to interoperate with things like DOS FAT file systems. Okay, you can actually run NFS on a FAT file system. FAT file system has no concept of usernames. Okay, you simply create files and you can access those files anywhere you want. Okay, this is the most common use of FAT file system, USB drive. Okay, you can put whatever files you want on the USB drive. If you stick it on some machine, all of those files remain accessible. You can't say it was created by this user, is not given to read permission. All files are always accessible. Because for NFS to work with file systems like that, you have to make very minimum assumptions about what the file system will do. Okay? If you say anything more, then NFS or any file system, distributed file system, becomes incompatible with the underlying local file system. So those are all mandatory attributes. Here are recommended attributes. These are attributes that would be nice to have so NFS can do its job better. Okay, because think of a case where you have a FAT file system which has no concept of username or user permissions. Okay. You exported this FAT file system or NFS. Some user has mounted this file system, is trying to access it. Maybe they want to change permission bits or some such thing. Those kinds of operations will not be supported by the native file system. Okay? So they will come to the native file system will just say ignore. I don't know what to do with this. Okay? So now, but the user expects that to work. So these are all attributes that are nice to have in your local file system. They're not required. NFS can do without it. And here you will see standard things like owner, time of access, okay? Access control list, which are permission bits and so on. Okay? So these are called recommended attributes. So if you have these support for this in your local file system, the NFS implementation will work better. Okay? Doesn't mean it won't work, but it just works better in this case. So the philosophy of NFS is maximum interoperability, okay, which means that you should make minimum assumptions about what is required from the underlying file system. Okay. The other important thing to keep in mind is NFS is not a native file system at all. It's a layer that sits on other file system that allows you to access files in that file system. Okay, we will actually see real distributed file systems which take the whole approach from they basically manage the files and they allow access to the file. NFS philosophy is different. You can use other native file systems and you're just going to have a layer to make those files accessible. Okay, this is why it has become widely used, because underlying file systems change, but NFS doesn't go away because you still need a way to access those files remotely. So NFS has lived on for decades, even though the file systems that are used underneath have changed significantly. Okay. Other distributed file systems haven't evolved in the same way. Okay. So they take the end-to-end approach where they manage the data and they manage the access to the data. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about consistency, okay, within the NFS world. And here is where you start seeing several differences between what you're typically used to and how NFS is going to behave. Okay, because consistency in NFS is actually weaker than what a local file system is going to do. Okay, and the main difference is the following. Okay, here is how a local file system would behave, and here is how NFS is going to behave. Okay. In a local file system, if you are actually going to have a read which follows a write, so you make a modification to a file, and then some other process on that machine reads the file, it will see the modified data immediately. All file system changes are immediately visible. That is what is shown here. Okay. Here is essentially original file. It has contents A, B. Process A has written C to the file, so the file becomes A, B, and C. Subsequently, after this write has occurred, if any process B comes along and reads the file, it will actually see this version of the file, which is ABC, not the old version, AB. Okay. That is what you expect on a local file system. You make a change, and then if you basically open the file, you should see the changed contents. Okay. That's what you would expect. Now it so happens, okay, that NFS actually does not give you that guarantee. Okay. This is because NFS has caching and other things that do not actually allow you to do this. So here is a typical NFS case. Okay. Same file AB is on the server. Two machines, or let's say this process A and B are now on two client machines. A is here and B is here. Okay. Both have opened the file. Okay. NFS, what it does is it will allow you to cache a copy of the file on the client. So what is going to happen is a copy of the file is cached here, AB, and a copy of the file is cached here. Okay. So now this is the master copy, there's a cached copy, there's a cached copy. Process A modifies the file, exactly the same thing here. Okay, so now the file has become ABC. Okay. Process B now reads the file. Okay, it's going to not see ABC because those changes are yet to be sent to the server, and the server is yet to notify to machine 2 that the file has changed. Okay. So this is a very simple experiment you can do. You can actually log into two EdLab machines, okay, into your home directory. On one, okay, you can actually open a file. Okay, exactly. Let's say there's a file. Foo, you open the file and you write one character to it. Okay, and you hit save. Okay. Immediately open that file on the other machine. Okay. You will actually not see that change for up to 30 seconds. Okay, because that's the interval at which NFS is going to flush changes from the client to the server, and the server can notify them. So it's a very different semantics. Modifications to files are not immediately accessible. Okay. Put another way, consistency guarantees are not strong, they are much weaker. Okay, remember when I talked about consistency, we said to make a modification, the modified data should be immediately accessible if all copies are consistent. NFS does not support any notion of a strong consistency. Consistency guarantees are much weaker in this case. Okay? So if you formalize that a little bit, what you will see is what NFS has. So what most of file systems will do are what are called Unix semantics. That's the notion of what is the consistency guarantee, which says every operation of the file is instantly visible to all processes on that machine. Okay, that is called Unix semantic. That says I make a change, I open the file, after I make the change, I see the modified version of the file. Okay, that's what you expect. NFS, you have what are called session semantics, where it says that changes are only going to be visible at the end of the session, at the very latest. Okay. So you open a file, you create a new file session, you can make whatever change you want. When you close the file, that is the time at which the file system is required to make the changes visible. Okay. In NFS, you do this every 30 seconds. You don't actually wait for the file to be closed, but the guarantees are actually at a session level. Okay. You can make whatever change you want, and only when you close it will you actually change, flush all the content. There are other semantics. Some file systems have gone to transactional semantics, okay, which means when you open a file, you start a transaction, you make some changes. When the transaction commits, you flush all the changes become visible. While the transaction is quote unquote running, you are not expected to make the changes visible. Okay? That's also different from Unix semantics, but you do get all or nothing guarantees. All the changes are visible all at once, or nothing is visible. It's not like I wrote 3 records and they become visible, but I'm not done with it. Okay? So it's a batched mode where you're transactional semantic. There are versions of this file that support transactional guarantees. Okay? In fact, Windows at one point was considering implementing transactional semantics into NTFS, which I believe they haven't yet completely done, but that was something they were working on as well. Okay? So, but then there are immutable files, which says files once you create them cannot be changed at all. That was basically, so if you change them, you have to create a new version of the file. So you are versioning. Okay? Those are versioning file systems. Okay? They also exist where every change basically creates a new file. Okay? That's the file name is the same, but you have a new version of the file. So you have 5 versions. Okay? So different semantics in the distributed systems world that all are different from Unix semantics. Okay? So you have session semantics, immutable file semantics, and transactional semantics. Any questions on this? Okay. So now we'll come back to this issue I was mentioning, which is why is NFS version 4 stateful? Okay. Now the reason they may have one of the reasons, I should say the primary reason, one of the reasons they decided to make the server stateful was they wanted to implement file locking functionality. Okay. Many file systems, or almost all file systems, allow you to actually lock a file. When you lock a file, that means no one else is allowed to read or write to the file. Okay. Typically, when you open a file, you don't actually ask for a lock. Okay. You just open it, you read and write it, you close it. But if you wanted to, you could open the file and actually get a lock on the file. This would prevent automatically other processes from reading or writing. You can also have read-write locks. If you have a read lock, you can have others read it but not write it, or if you have a write lock, then no one else can do anything to the file. Now question is, where is file system locking useful? Can you think of any application where locking may actually be used by the higher level application? Why even have locking at the file system level? Any thoughts on why you would need locking?
If 2 applications try to modify the same file.
Okay, no, that is a generic case. As 2 applications are trying to modify the same file, ideally you should have a lock, and if the file system gives you locking functionality, you don't have to implement lock in the application. That's true. I'm just asking, can you think of any such application that try to modify the same file where locking is actually an important property? Thoughts?
Something like a database that you implement
Okay. Databases could naturally use file system locking because they have to lock at least when they do transaction, they need notion of a lock. So that's one case. Although I will say, having said that, I'm going to say that database typically prefer more fine-grained locking. They don't want to lock the whole database and concurrency control and the sequentialize. But having said that, that's one use case where you may actually use locks. Another simple application where locking is widely used is email. Okay? So your inbox is a shared file. Okay? Typically it will accessed by a client. You may have a client on your phone, your client on your desktop and so on. They're accessing your inbox and there's a mail server that's delivering mail to your inbox. Okay? To ensure correctness of your inbox, typically all of this is done through locking. You do not want a user to be deleting mails from their inbox while new mail arrives. It's going to corrupt your inbox. Because the inbox is actually a database of emails. Each record in your inbox is actually an email. Okay? And it's simply a database of all messages that have been received. You want to ensure that this is the modifications to your inbox are done in a consistent fashion. And this is one primary example of the most widely used locking example in most file systems is mail. Okay? Any mail client will actually implement locking. You basically open the inbox, it will say give me a lock, okay, it will get all the mail and it will unlock. And periodically as you try to refresh, saying has new mail arrived, you grab a new lock, it will re-examine the inbox, it will release. Okay? And you will not have a case where if you delete it, it's going to basically corrupt your inbox. You basically use locking for this thing. Okay, so, and the reason NFS implemented locking was until version 3, you couldn't implement locks or you couldn't implement email correctly over NFS. Okay? If your inbox was actually stored on an NFS partition and you accessed email on a client on a mounted NFS partition, there was a very high probability sooner or later your inbox will be corrupt and you will lose all your mail. Because NFS didn't have locking. Okay, your client is merely accessing your data and the server is going to modify the data and you will have corruption. Okay? So even until NFS version 3, if you look at any mail client server documentation, it will say do not put the inbox on a shared NFS partition. Put it on a local file and have them access it over a protocol like IMAP, which is remote access. Okay? This is basically how file system mail administrator would configure mail. And the reason was version 3 did not support locking, it was not stateful. And now that version 4 is stateful, it actually supports locking. It goes without saying that to support locking, you need file system state. You need to know who has a lock on the file, that is state. So if the file system is stateless, you can't implement locking. So now that you actually have a stateful server, you can implement locking, which means that you are allowed now to put your inboxes on NFS partition and mail clients can actually get locks and will not have corruption of data and so on. But same is true of databases. If you have databases store data on a mounted partition and independent clients access it without locking, you may get problems. Okay, so these are all things to keep in mind. So this is why they have actually gone the stateful model. You can implement locking. So here are some of the calls you can use. You can lock the entire file. You can check whether a file has been granted. You can lock a range of bytes. You can say lock bytes 10 to 25. So that is, those bytes are not going to be accessible, but the rest of the file is accessible. So you can actually do more fine-grained locks than the entire file. You can grab locks on the portion of the file. You can renew a lock. Okay. Locks in this case are going to be given to you for a fixed amount of time. This is to prevent a case where client grabbed a lock, machine crashed. Okay, now the file is locked forever because when you boot up, the fact that there was a process that had the lock is lost. Process is dead. Okay, so now the file is locked forever. No one else will be able to access the file. Which is why all locks have a timeout. Okay, if that timeout period passes, the lock is released automatically. Just to ensure that you will not have cases where you grab a lock, process crashes, machine crashes, and the lock is still in use, then nobody is able to release the lock. So you basically, which is why you have a new call, which will say when the timeout expires, if you actually still want to hold it, renew your lock for another timeout period. Okay, so this is how locking is implemented. Okay. There are equivalent things which basically are called share reservation. which allow you to, these are not quite locks, but these are just a way to sort of think about locking by saying, deny certain operations on the file while I access the file. So you can say that I want, so you basically say set the denial state to read, which means all other read requests are going to fail. Okay? Set the denial state to write, which means deny all write requests to the file. Okay? This is the equivalent of read-write locks if you think about it. Or you can say both, saying I want to deny all read and write requests to the file. So rather than grabbing a lock, you can also say this is the somewhat analogous to saying get a read lock or a write lock, or get a read-write lock which will deny everything. Okay? So that functionality is also supported. The table simply shows very trivially saying if I have a read lock, all read operations are going to fail. If I have a write lock, all write operations are going to fail, and so on. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about caching, and then you will probably wrap up a little. Okay, so caching, as I said, is implemented in NFS for performance reasons. When a client application opens a file, it can cache blocks of the file here, which basically allows any processes running here to have local access to the blocks. You don't have to send RPC request if you actually fetch that block on here. Okay, so caching is simply there as a performance optimization, but because it is in there, it causes consistency problem. Although there is a one master copy. Okay, remember this is the remote access model. Okay, I'll show you upload download model in just a moment. So NFS by definition implements the remote access model and all read and write requests are sent off to the server. Yes, but as a performance optimization, NFS also allows caching, so that if you read a block already, you can keep a copy of it, and the client asks for it again, you reply from the cache, you don't go back to the server. And that brings up a consistency problem, which says that if another client is also accessing the file and it modifies those blocks, my cache data is invalid at this point. I have out-of-date version of the file. Okay? And how do you ensure consistency in this regime? Okay. Now the thing about NFS is it is silent on the topic of consistency. The NFS specification says nothing about consistency. It leaves it to the implementation. It says that yes, consistency is important, but the protocol is not going to say you must implement this cache consistency semantics. Okay? That is left to the specific implementation. So each implementation is left to decide on its own what guarantees it wants to provide. Now most implementations do a lazy guarantee, which essentially says we will not give you any guarantee. Okay? Every 30 seconds, I'm going to look at my cache, NFS client cache, and I'm going to look at all my dirty blocks, which are the blocks that have been written to, and I'm going to simply send them to the server. Okay? So that is the consistency policy. Every 30 seconds, flush. Okay? Send all the changed blocks to the server. Okay? So that's all NFS is going to do for you. Okay? Which essentially means if you have concurrent accesses to the file on different machines, you are going to see inconsistencies for up to 30 seconds because you do not know if some other client has modified the file. Okay, so it's not a good idea in NFS to open the same file on multiple machines and concurrently write to them, because you are going to have trouble with the way NFS is going to deal with all these writes are going to overwrite each other unless you implement locking and other things on top. Okay. So cache can have stale data for up to 30 seconds. If you make a modification, you open it somewhere else, you will still see old data. Okay, that's something you have to keep in mind. Okay, now having said that, NFS also allows you to implement the upload-download model. Okay, so which is what is shown here, NFS version 4 in particular, because it is stateful, it does remote access model, it also does upload-download model. And this is called client delegation. Okay, so here is the server, which has a master copy. Okay. Client opens the file, server says, I delegate this file to you. You deal with it. You have temporarily taken over the master copy, so a copy of the file gets sent here. Okay. All subsequent accesses are local. You do not now send read and write requests to the server. They are all local. Okay, and then at a later point, you can flush the file back to the server, so you take over the responsibility again. Or the server can recall delegation as well. Okay. And typically, the way this is done is if multiple clients open the file, you basically take back any delegation, so you fall back to the remote access mode. Okay. If only one client accesses a file, you say to optimize your performance, I'm going to give you the entire file, you deal with it. But when multiple clients access the file, you say, I'll keep the master copy, send me read and write requests, and they will be handled at the server. Yeah, so that's also a part of NFS version 4, that they implemented delegation as a performance option. So version 4 does both remote access as well as the upload download mode, where you can actually get the local copy and Octave local copies for performance reasons. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, this is also stateful. As you can imagine, you need to figure out who you're delegated which file. Okay, you will say file 1 is here, file 2 is somewhere else. If I need to recall delegation, all of that state has to be kept at the server. So locking makes version 4 stateful, delegations makes the server stateful, so there are many reasons why you have now added state to the server. Perform all of these optimizations. Okay. So last point I'm going to make here, and then we'll wrap up, is this notion of RPC failures and how NFS deals with it. Okay. You may remember this discussion from a long time ago where I said RPC requests may get lost, replies may get lost, and the typical way to handle this is you will retransmit the request, but the server has to do something which ensure idempotency. Okay. If you perform the same operation twice on the server, the result should be the same as if it was performed exactly once. This is called idempotency operation. Okay. Now the reason you want idempotency here is, if I say append a string to the file, this is my request, I send it off to the server. Okay. Server performs the request, but the reply gets lost. Okay. This is what I think is shown somewhere here. The reply gets lost. So if I say retransmit the request saying perform this operation again, and it's performed twice, the string will get appended twice to the server. You don't want that. Okay. You want it, no matter how many times you send to the server, you want it to look like it was performed exactly once. So there are multiple ways to deal with it. One is you say I'm going to run NFS over TCP. You run NFS over TCP at the application level, which is in this case NFS client and the server level, you don't have to deal with it. Lost packets are dealt with by TCP, it will retransmit and do the right thing for you. Okay? But when NFS was originally designed back about 30, 40 years ago, they actually ran NFS over UDP. Okay? Which means that there was no guarantee when you sent an RPC request or UDP that it was going to reach the server or the reply was going to come back to you. So you had to put code in the NFS client and server to figure out, if I send a read request or a write request and I don't get a reply in a certain amount of time, I need to retransmit. I need to time out and retransmit. Okay, so because NFS allows you to run over TCP and UDP, to this day, you will need application level code. When I say application, I mean NFS client and server, not user processes, code to deal with RPC failures. Okay. If you run over TCP, this all becomes moot because you don't have to do anything. The network is doing this work. Okay, so how does NFS ensure idempotency? The way it is done is shown in this picture. Every RPC request is going to get a transaction ID. It's a unique transaction ID. Okay. Every request you send gets a sequence number, okay, and it's unique across the system. So what you will do is, when you receive the request, you process it, you will also keep it a request log saying, I received transaction RPC request X1234. In this case, I processed this, here's the reply I generated. Okay. And then you will send the reply. If it so happens that this client times out and sends a request, or one of the replies gets lost, as is shown here. Okay, so basically, the request reached the server, the request was processed, you sent a reply was lost. The client never heard it. So the client has timed out and sent the same 1, 2, 3, 4 request again. Okay. So when this request comes, the server's first job is, have I already seen this request before? Did I actually already execute RPC number 1, 2, 3, 4? Okay. In this case, you will say the answer is yes, because you put it in the cache, a log. And then you will say, if I executed it, what was the result? What was the reply I generated? So you simply take the reply from the cache and you retransmit. You do not re-execute. This is how you are going to ensure idempotency. You will keep track of what you have executed in the recent past. You will keep the replies. The request comes back to you. You will simply assume something went wrong in the network. But because you have to be idempotent, you cannot re-execute that request. Okay, by definition, when you write multiple times, there's no idempotency. You will actually overwrite things and so on. So you will ensure it by not executing it at all for a second time. Okay? So from the NFS client and server standpoint, this is idempotent abstraction, because you're never, regardless of how many times you send an RPC, it's going to only get executed once. Okay, after that you send it again, it won't get re-executed. You simply get a reply from the cache, okay, without re-executing. Is that clear? So this is one way by which you can ensure idempotency in RPCs. In fact, when I talked about RPCs and idempotency, I said we'll come back to it when we talk about NFS to see how NFS is. It's not the most elegant way, but it works. Okay? You could have actually made the code of NFS more idempotent and so on. That's more work. Here you're simply saying, I'm going to keep track and simply be smart and not re-execute retransmitted requests. That's all you do. Any questions here? Yes?
What about the second case where you just need the reply?
Yes. You are saying, what about the second case here? So in the second case, the reply is not lost. It just takes longer for you to perform the operation. You are timed out and resend the request. You will treat it the same way, because from the server's perspective, you don't know, you send the same reply. 2 replies will come to the client. The client also has to be smart enough to say, I sent one RPC 1, 2, 3, 4 twice, and I've gotten 2 replies. I already saw the reply, so I'm going to ignore it. Because the client has to be smart if you get multiple replies to multiple timeouts. That's all you do. Okay, so this is called a duplicate request cache, okay, where you're going to keep track of cached results. Okay. Last thing, which I'm going to run out of time, but last thing I want to talk about is security. Okay, typically all NFS requests between the client and server go unencrypted. Okay. You can actually see the data. If you say, give me a block, that block is sent unencrypted. In a LAN, this is not a problem, okay, but the NFS allows you to mount a volume over a WAN over the internet. Okay, so you can actually mount an NFS server data on the internet and say, now you request some file, all the data is coming unencrypted over the wire. Okay, so you can see all the blocks of the file going by, or you can see all the RPC requests going by. That's not good. Okay, right? With all your file system contents are being, can be snooped up. Okay, so what NFS version 4 does is it implements security by simply essentially using the standard encryption protocol. Okay, so essentially encrypts the connection between the client and the server. Okay, it's very similar to SSL in HTTP. Okay. All of the RPC requests before they go over the wire are encrypted by the encryption layer. So this is your RPC. The encryption layer sits below. Everything that goes down first gets encrypted, then it gets sent out. Then it gets decrypted and handed to the RPC layer. So you can use a number of different protocols here. You can see Kerberos, and there are all these other protocols. So NFS doesn't care. Okay. It just says that you should support security, and that can be implemented as a layer below RPC. So this allows you to do what are called secure RPCs. It's another feature of version 4, which allows you to secure the communication. Otherwise, when data goes over the channel, if this happens to be the internet, somebody can snoop on your data and see what is in the contents of your file if you did not do this. Okay, so security is also something that NFS version 4 is. So we'll stop here for today. Next time I'm going to talk about other file system, less detail than today, because we're going to do 3 file systems next time. They will spend most of our time doing one. Okay? But you have now a good overview of how distributed file systems work and what are various considerations.